This is Radio Free Hillsdale, 101.7 FM. I'm Scot Bertram, and with me today is State Senator Mike Shirkey, the Senate Majority Leader here in the state of Michigan. Senator, how are you?
Good morning, Scott. I love the Radio Free Hillsdale. I like that.
Well, if you like it, I guess we'll keep it around. That's, yeah. Find him online, senatormikeshirkey.com, and also on Facebook. Just search for Senator Mike Shirkey. A couple of topics to get get with you today, Senator. I wanted to start, though, with an important decision that is being appealed, but we did get a ruling on the gerrymandering case, the redistricting case, a court ruling that Michigan must remap its districts prior to 2020. Now, that might or might not happen, I guess, depending on how the court case moves forward, but what can you tell us about where we are right now?
So you're right. What I consider to be a rather activist federal district court decided to rule that the district maps drawn back in 2010, 2011 were unconstitutional. But if you read the entirety of the 146-page finding, what you really discover is they didn't have as much problem with the actual drawing of the maps. They had extreme difficulty accepting all the accompanying documentation, text messages, emails, and so forth, about the purposes of some of the lines. And frankly, full disclosure here, I agree with their finding that the motivations and statements regarding how those maps were built were a little egregious, and they deserve to be a hand slap. Mm-hmm. But the reality is the actual lines themselves are not egregious. Mm-hmm. In fact, I can demonstrate that by showing district maps in virtually every other state that look more Byzantine than ours do.
Sure.
But this is a court that has got a history of being stinkers. There's a Maryland and North Carolina case already at the United States Supreme Court that they must rule on before the end of June, which will splash over on this particular case as well. And you were correct. We have filed our motion for appeal. We filed our motion for stay, and we're hoping that the appeal is automatic, and we're hoping the motion for a stay gets considered here within the next couple of weeks or so. I can't really say much more than that because there's not much more to do. We are investigating in the Senate. We're investigating how we would organize ourselves to redraw the maps for the next term, 2020 election.
Yeah.
But then that also, as you, I'm sure, are aware, it throws into question, can somebody like me, for instance, if forced to run for a 2-year term, can I actually run again? Because the Constitution is pretty clear. You can only win a Senate seat twice. So there's going to be lots of questions that need to be resolved. But I think everybody's pretty much hit the pause button until we get some signal from the United States Supreme Court.
The ballot initiative that was passed this past November in 2018, how would that play into a mandatory redraw? Would it at all, or does that wait till 2022? How does that fit in?
That actually adds just another level of complexity and confusion to this, because the ballot initiative would not affect redrawing the 2020 maps. And then, in fact, the matter is, if forced to do so, we would go through an enormous amount of work and a lot of money to redraw the maps for just a 2-year period. And those maps would be based on virtually 10-year-old data.
Right.
Because we don't have the next census. So the entire thing, if you just sit back and think about the entirety of the ruling, it's I understand that they were upset for some of the words that were used in describing the motivations for drawing the lines, but everything else about it makes no sense whatsoever. And we're hoping that our Supreme Court rules along those lines. And then the new redistricting process that was approved by voters last year, that goes into process in 2022.
Not to mention the fact, I know there are different issues with the congressional districts and also the state or the Senate and House districts, but on the congressional level, we are in a situation now where it is evened up, right? It is 7-7, and so you're having a court come in and say this thing is not fair, even though the results are absolutely even at this point.
Well, yeah, that is the data that how it manifests with the congressional districts, but even in the Senate, state Senate, we lost 5 seats.
Yeah.
this last election. So nobody can claim that they're set up so that people are injured or disenfranchised.
Mm-hmm.
I believe, this is just one man's opinion, but I believe the United States Supreme Court will essentially rule that redistricting is inherently a political process.
Yes.
That must follow some rational rules, which we have always had. Those rules, and we've always been tested in court, and we've always been have satisfied the test in court. But this new one that starts in 2022. Well, here's my prediction. My prediction is by the middle of the 2020s, there's going to be some serious buyer's remorse by voters in Michigan, both on the redistricting and on maybe even on the recreational marijuana, having it been so liberally applied. So we're just going to have to wait now. And as you know, Scott, I've always said voters are always right
mm-hmm.
when I don't agree, but that doesn't mean that us voters won't learn something and want
yes.
to have some things changed in the future.
State Senator Mike Shirkey with us here on Radio Free Hillsdale, 101.7 FM, the Senate Majority Leader. There is a bill now heading to the governor. We're just coming off a winter season with multiple cancellations, no matter where you are, due to snow and, of course, due to the extreme cold this winter. There's a new bill, again, passed the Senate, heading to the governor, which would forgive, 4 snow days to districts across the state. There were already there are already some snow days built in the calendar. This would add a few more.
Right now, state schools are allowed to have 6 weather involved days off without having to affect their calendar. They can apply for 3 additional ones to the Michigan Department of Education, so for a total of 9. But this year, it was, as you just identified, was an extreme year, and we actually had 4 days that were deemed state emergencies.
Mm-hmm.
And it's difficult to argue that if the governor calls a state of emergency as a result of weather, that we should also insist that kids go to school that day. It's a bit of a mess, but at the end of the day, we decided that was a legitimate reason to add up to 4 more. Schools would have to apply for those additional 4.
Mm-hmm.
They would be essentially automatically granted. And we only did it for 1 year because I was concerned that we didn't have enough time to really understand what the definition of state emergency is. And in the future, we could call state emergencies that maybe didn't apply to
sure.
School interruptions. And so but it was what was very interesting about this legislative process, I call it the marvel and miracle of the legislative process, is that we got the bill approved for this limitation of 4 days and 1 year in the Senate, but it didn't get awarded immediate effect, and so it would have not become effective until April of 2020, which of course would have been ridiculously too late.
Right.
The bill went to the House and was slightly altered in a good way. Basically to make sure that schools didn't have to take the 4 days off, but they just had the choice of doing so. And then it was awarded immediate effect in the House. And it came back to the Senate, and cooler heads prevailed, and we were able to gain enough votes to provide immediate effect. So that provides immediate clarity for all school districts in Michigan.
Senator Mike Shirkey, one other issue I wanted to bring up this week, and it might be one that's on people's minds. I saw a story that mentioned it in the Free Press recently, and then a Detroit news story as well on what's called using a weighted formula for education funding. Governor Whitmer and educators are pushing for this weighted funding formula. It builds off the allowance as is currently and includes additional funding for students with more costly education needs. That could mean a number of things, whether it be a more technical, skilled sort of education facility or something like that. I know this is just kind of beginning the process of a discussion about this weighted formula. What's your understanding about it, and what do you think that Michigan needs to go?
So my understanding is that the question is whether or not the foundational allowance is too simple and it doesn't accommodate the variations that occur across districts and even
sure.
in districts for different schools. And I get that, but it's to me it's problematic because the definition of, for instance, special needs, let's talk about that, tends to evolve a little bit. And Also, the definition of whether somebody in high school who is advanced needs additional money versus somebody who's maybe not as advanced or is not as aggressive in their education pursuits. So there's a lot of variability that can be built into this notion of doing it, on a weighted average basis. And it's fluid also, because in 1 year a school may have weighted in one direction and another year that different.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's a narrow path that we have to navigate here on keeping it predictable and relatively simple versus making it so complex that it just becomes a big statewide debate every year. And I'm going to throw in another dimension that you didn't mention, Scott, and that is I've long said that for certain schools, there's two things that are important. There's the fixed cost, or actually keep the school open and running.
Sure.
And then there's the variable cost of the number of students. And we basically fund on a variable cost basis. And so schools that are losing population, whether it's something that's attributed to their performance or just natural flow of people, they tend to get hurt the most. And which begs the question of, should there be a foundation fixed cost for schools and then a variable cost based on the number of students? So one thing for sure, you and I could come up with an infinite number of ways in which we could fund schools.
Yes.
And I tend to think that we should, kind of default to the simplest and the one that's the easiest to defend. But I understand the interest of those who are advocating for different formula.
All right, State Senator Mike Shirkey. You can find him online at senatormikeshirkey.com, on Facebook as well. Just search for Senator Mike Shirkey. Senator, thanks so much for the time. We appreciate it.
You're welcome, sir. Talk to you in a couple weeks.